Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. US and global markets have continued their downward spirals amid Donald Trump's tariffs, wiping out billions of dollars in stock value. Now, a minimum 10% tariff took effect on all imports to the US on Saturday, the 5th of April. However, many nations will face much higher tariffs starting from Wednesday, the 9th of April, which includes Malaysia with a 24% levy. Now, is this a watershed moment for global trade? Well, joining me on the show now to discuss this further is Distinguished Professor Emeritus Dr. Thye, Research Professor at Sunway University. Professor Wu, thank you for being on the show with me today. What's your initial assessment of the potential economic impact of this so-called reciprocal tariff regime on global trade?
Trump's destruction of the system of international trade will cause great damage if this bomb is not diffused. The reason is there will be an immediate downturns in many countries, especially the ones that are dependent on exports like us. And if these countries that experience the downturn start putting tariffs against all imports, in other words, not just against US goods, but against goods from other countries as well, the cumulative effect would be a repeat of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the first thing to do to reduce collateral damage is that the rest of us do not start hurling tariffs against each other. That's, I think, is the most important thing we must do.
Is there a risk of that? Is there a risk of this escalating into a global trade war as countries start, implementing retaliatory tariffs?
There is a risk because the trade war is part of a wider effort by the United States to reset the global system. And what is being now causing alarm in Washington, D.C. is that the world has changed from one that is dominated by the United States to a world in which there is now an equal economic political power, as much, if not, if it is not already a multipolar world, it is going to be one very soon. And so there's very great anxiety to avoid the historical mystics of a confrontation between the rising power and the new power. Because in this nuclear age, we cannot afford a confrontation like the way that the rise of Germany led to World War I and the rise of Japan to Pearl Harbor. So what that means is the United States is now engaged in a race to build as big a sphere of influence as possible, largely because that's the only way to stop a war, which is that you have your space, I have my space. And you could say that the Chinese actions in the South China Sea with the 9-dash line, BRI, RCEP, are parts of the effort to expand the Chinese sphere of influence. So if we are unfortunately become willing participants into choosing the spheres of influence, then we would certainly put tariffs against the countries that belong to the other sphere. And that is what the danger is.
Right. Okay. Yeah, the Singapore Prime Minister, Lawrence Wong, he said that the era of rules-based globalization and free trade is over, that we're entering a new phase, one that's more, in his words, arbitrary, protectionist, and dangerous. And I wonder if we, with this lens, if through this perspective, How then should countries like Malaysia, small countries, middle power countries, how should we respond to this new dangerous era?
From an individual perspective, the world is beyond our control. There are these two elephants that are potentially going to fight. And so what we want to do is to keep them apart. And that's what the sphere of influence is designed to do. But any sphere of influence must have buffer zones, because two things rubbing against each other is not such a great idea. The thing is, the rest of us should, instead of joining the different spheres, we should all work together to be a buffer zone by keeping the United Nations structure alive as much as possible. In other words, we, the middle powers in particular, should come to an agreement that we will keep free trade among ourselves. And we'll be happy to have free trade with China and the United States if they come along. And the only globally legitimate body that is able to coordinate all of this is the United Nations and the WTO and the UN agencies. So the first thing we really need to do, that Malaysia is the leader of ASEAN this year. ASEAN should discuss with the EU to form the first block of buffer zone countries. And I can tell you, Korea and Japan will have every incentive to join the buffer zone of countries. We don't want to be in either sphere. We want to be in the buffer zone, and we want to make the buffer zone as large as possible.
All right. Talk to me about that. What are the, if we were to think through having kind of this buffer zone of countries, this club of middle powers, so to speak, what is the thinking there? How do we maintain being in the middle without, as you say, touching into either spheres of influence or playing the neutral role? Is that the way you see global trade moving forward? That this is a choice that you have to stay in the middle to not upset either growing spheres of influence?
The truth is, a sphere needs the coordination. The coordination, a natural one, would be the G20 minus US and China. But they are welcome to join too. That's the thing. We are everybody's friends. No. If China wishes to join that to be to restore global trade back to be part of the club, that would be part of normal global trade. Then the United States will find itself self-marginalized because we have put up all these tariffs against everybody else. In the long run, if we are able to maintain this, what there is of the world system, the United States unable to expand its spheres, the only way it can be safe against China would be to come back into the family of nations.
Right. This is quite interesting, Prof. Wu. When you talk about the self-marginalization from the United States, let's use the Liberation Day tariffs as an example. Many people argue, or maybe are hoping, that this is a negotiation tactic from Donald Trump, that he's actually looking at waiting for a better deal from each of the countries to be negotiated. How do you see that? Do you see that as, is that your perspective as well? And what does that mean in terms of how we should respond to America's approach to global trade under Donald Trump's administration?
That approach is a claim that Donald Trump is creating bargaining chips for himself. That's what it is. Yes, there's some of that, but you have to also admit that his goal is not just to get a better bargaining chips in the sphere of trade. He wants to get better bargaining chips in the technological competition with China. He also wants to have bargaining chips in geostrategic isolation of China. So given these different motives, we will not return to this is not his goal. In other words, a temporary shaking up the system to make you guys give me concessions and we go back to the good old days, but with the playing field tilted slightly in favor of the United States. He wants to partition the playing field. That is the goal. He would love everybody else to be in his sphere. The truth is, he's counting on the Europeans to have no choice but stay in his sphere of influence. Because what he's really concerned about when he proclaimed Ukraine to be the country that started the war, he basically switched sides from Ukraine to Russia. That is certainly not trade reason why he switched side. He switched side because he's trying to weaken the US, the Russian-Chinese alliance, so that he can start transferring military assets from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which makes our region even more dangerous.
Right.
The first thing we now know is he's going to give nuclear submarines to the Australians to put at the bottom of the South China Sea. The Chinese are going to put nuclear submarines there too. Basically, we are becoming collateral damage. To think of this as just a trade war is to miss the bigger picture of what that is trying to be reshaped.
Wow.
I will not give a deep, rational pattern to his actions. He's creating chips as much as he can without fear of consequences, largely because you can announce 30% today and you reverse it tomorrow, just like the way he's been teasing Canada and Mexico. You know, these are traditional US allies. Canada has fought in every war the US has fought in, even though Canada has no direct stakes in them. Canada was in Iraq, Canada was in Afghanistan, Canada was in Vietnam. Why was he so eager to now talk about Greenland, Gaza, Panama, and then Canada? Because it is enlarging the sphere of influence.
Right.
And this is something that is contrary to what the spirit of the United Nations is. And I think the Europeans have waken up that they don't want to be pawns either. That is why I think an Atlantic Pacific alliance of neutral nations. Just think of the Bandung Conference. But in this case, we bring in the middle powers. And that is the beginning. And when the beginning is, and when it's the block of ASEAN, Korea, Japan, EU is seen as viable, the world will join, especially if we uphold the principles that the United Nations is based upon.
That was Distinguished Professor Emeritus Datuk Dr. Wu Wing Thye, and we're going to take a quick break. After this, we'll be back with more on Trump's tariffs. Stay tuned. welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Let's continue our look at the potential impact of US President Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs. Joining us now is Dr. Deborah Elms, Head of Trade Policy at the Hinrich Foundation in Singapore. Dr. Elms, thank you for being on the show with me today. How are you interpreting this new tariff regime from the Trump administration? Is there a coherent trade strategy at play here?
No, this is the most incoherent set of policies that we've seen, well, certainly in my lifetime, and I hope that none of us ever see something so incoherent again. The objectives the United States is trying to pursue, as far as you can tell, are conflicting. They're conflicting within Donald Trump's own head, and they're conflicting among his advisors, and the policies that are emanating as a result of that, you can imagine, are equally chaotic. Now, part of that is because Trump himself loves chaos. And so for him, it's actually okay if it's chaotic and the rollout. But it creates real challenges, of course, for anybody who's trying to operate in the real world, especially businesses. What should they do? Should they invest? Do they need to hire? Do they need to fire? Like, what are the issues that a company needs to deal with? It's changing literally minute by minute. And the sum total of this is not feeling very liberation-like for anyone, including, crucially, American consumers and American businesses who are at the wrong end of this particular set of policies.
Right. Do you see the tariffs as final, Dr. Elms, or are they designed to be walked back? I'm just wondering, if countries offer Trump the right deal, could he then revise these tariff regime?
It's sort of anyone's guess. I mean, I think his intention was not to make changes in these policies this time, or at least not to make many changes. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is just strictly legal, which is if you're going to argue that we have a global economic emergency, and then you carve out specific deals for specific countries or specific sectors or whatever, it's hard to make the legal argument that what you have here is an economic emergency that requires a global response. So I think for legal reasons, not that this administration is constrained by legal issues at the moment, but if they were, that would be a problem. But also because, again, they're trying to do multiple things at once. And so are they going to leave these tariffs in place? Possibly for the rest of my lifetime, because once you put a tariff in place, it's very hard to take it back down again. Or they could be paused, they could be postponed, they could be reversed, they could be reversed for some, but not all, they could be partially reversed. I mean, I think that's the beauty from Trump's view is that it's completely uncertain, and he is the decision maker on whether or not to proceed or to reverse or to pause or to do none of the above.
Well, then how should governments respond to that kind of uncertainty? I'm just wondering how countries in ASEAN in particular should make sense and react. Malaysia has decided not to implement retaliatory measures, but there are countries who have vowed a response and have vowed countermeasures. How do we make sense of how to respond to this?
I think it's a bit of a challenge for governments as well as for companies. Sort of the first order of business is to figure out how bad are the reciprocal tariffs for your domestic economy. In the case of Malaysia, the reciprocal tariff number is not pleasant because it's in the 20s. 20% price increase, 26% price increase overnight is not easy to manage. That tariff, the full 26%, takes effect on April 9th. So you had very little time to prepare for it. 26 is not great. However, compared to some of our ASEAN neighbors, 26 is actually pretty good because, you know, Cambodia is at 49, Vietnam is at 46, Indonesia is higher than Malaysia. So there's some variation. Singapore got just 10, but that's partly because Singapore has no trade in goods deficit at all. So they got a sort of all-purpose unfairness category of 10%, which they're mad about, I mean, you can imagine, like, we didn't do anything wrong and we got hit anyways. That seems very unfair. So I think the question for governments is, again, relative to our competitors, are we okay? Are we not okay? And if we think this is really a problem, do we go and negotiate? Who are we negotiating with? And what are we going to offer? What are we going to do? I think if if I were Vietnam or Cambodia sitting at nearly 50% tariff increases, I think I would say, yeah, it's worth giving it a shot, because really, what have we got to lose? It's probably not going to go higher than 50, fingers crossed, but I don't think it would get worse. So let's try. If I'm Malaysia and I'm sort of halfway, it's harder. That decision is harder. Do we want to just stick with the 20s, tariffs in the 20s for the moment and see what happens? Do we want to try to offer something? I think even if Malaysia wanted to do something today, they're not going to be at the front of the queue. So I guess better maybe is to wait a bit and see what happens with those who are giving this strategy a go. And then if they're successful, then maybe you put yourself forward. And if they're not successful, then you say, well, that was a drag. Let's figure out what we can do now. I mean, the good news in ASEAN, just to sort of give a sort of silver lining, the good news in ASEAN is that we have a lot of other alternatives. And although the United States market has been big, lucrative, and important for a lot of firms in this region, it's not the only big, lucrative, and important market that we have globally. And so I think ASEAN as a whole is relatively well positioned, lots of free trade agreements in place with lots of markets, diversified economy, complicated and globally competitive supply chains. That will help, but it's still going to be an economic hit that we're all taking this week.
Do you think that it would make more sense for regional governments right now to negotiate as a bloc as opposed to individually? Would that be more, would we have more sway or more weight that way?
Clearly, yes. But then you have a problem with which ASEAN always has, which is how collective are we actually going to be? I mean, it's one thing to sort of say we're going to be unified, and it's another thing when some of us have, again, 50% tariffs almost, and some of us have 10. How coordinated are we going to be? We have different exposure to the US market, different exposure to others in the region. How coordinated can the region be beyond sort of anodyne statements that say things like, trade matters, don't stop export markets, don't pursue protectionism? I mean, I will see. It would be great if they would come together, I think. Right. Clearly, you have more influence and weight as 10 as opposed to 1. But it is a challenging thing to imagine how ASEAN members will actually deliver that.
Dr. Elms, it was quite unnerving to think that the tariffs could be in place for a very long time, as you mentioned in the beginning of your conversation. With that in mind, what kind of structural adjustments should ASEAN be considering for their economies in response to this kind of tariff unpredictability, but also for a longer term mitigation?
Well, I think the markets clearly had expected, first of all, lower tariffs in general, but also that we would have more clarity on last week on Liberation Day. They thought that that would be sort of the end, and then you would know and you could plan and you could get organized. And obviously that's not the way Trump operates. And so the first order of business, it seems to me, is to make sure that each firm is very clear. What are we producing? Where are we getting our inputs from? Where are we selling to? What happens to our own internal numbers if we can't sell to the US? I think that would be the way I would model it. What happens if we can't go to the US? What are our other alternatives? And then how costly will that be? Because there's a reason you don't go to the US, partly because it's costly to go elsewhere. You haven't looked at alternatives. It costs money to look for alternatives. So what would that look like? And then you sort of scenario plan backwards from that, and you say, well, in some cases, we will continue with our existing practices until we find that it really is economically uncompetitive. And each firm will have to make that calculation. And you'll have to start looking much harder, I think, at alternatives. Where else can we go, either right now, or where else can we go if we need to? And the number we're looking for is this. Like, if we get to this number, then our cost structure really doesn't work anymore, and we really do need to think. That's the pivot point. And it will vary by firm, it will vary by industry, it will vary by size of company. But I think this kind of scenario planning is crucial, even if you're a tiny company, because the world that you knew back at the end of December is not the world that we're living in now. And as we reshuffle supply chains, we are all going to have to figure out how to deal with this new world. And if I could just raise one more, if you're not sort of panicked enough about this situation, as everyone else pivots, one of the challenges that Malaysia and the rest of ASEAN, I think, will face is new levels of competition from other providers that are not currently in your domestic economy necessarily, or are not competing for the same export markets, that now, since they also cannot go to the US, suddenly may be looking for alternatives. And so I think it's not just competition in and out of the US that's alarming, but the potential reshuffling means that you are more exposed domestically, most likely, to competition, and you are also more exposed in other export markets than you might have been in the past. Now, you still might be very successful. Again, fortunately, Malaysia has extremely competitive, very nimble firms, and I think it will do well. But the point is, you're going to face a level of competition that you have not had to deal with, potentially for your lifetime either.
Right. And in summary, what will you be watching out for in the weeks ahead, either from Washington or the major trade players, that might signal to you how this plays out?
I don't even think it's weeks, it's literally minutes ahead. So, I mean, I think obviously the crucial issue at the moment is the relationship between the US and China, which affects ASEAN in particular. Sort of, if the US escalates tariffs, China's threatening counter retaliation at 34%. The US just announced that they're going to go to 50 on China, which would put overall tariffs on China into the "you're not trading with America" category. That is going to have implications for all of us, right? Because again, China's now going to be sitting on an awful lot of goods that they intended to send to the US that are no longer competitive. Where are those things going to go? ASEAN's an obvious destination for a lot of that. And because ASEAN countries are also plugged into supply chains with China, it means that the reduced demand for whatever those things are, whether they're high-tech electronics or low-tech clothing, those sort of demand is going to change. So that, again, I'm not suggesting that Malaysia is going to do poorly out of this, but I do think it's going to be highly disruptive, especially in the near term. So keeping a careful eye, unfortunately, on statements out of Washington, responses by China, and then increasingly what happens in other important markets like the European Union. Are they going to remain open for exports from this region? Are they going to be more cautious about exports from this region? That will give companies some better indication of how difficult this short-term period is going to be.
Thank you so much for speaking with us, Dr. Deborah Elms from the Hinrich Foundation in Singapore, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.